The grand ballroom of Astoria Palace had never seen such tension. Lady Eleanor Blackwood arrived at the annual Peace Gala with her chin held high and her emerald gown flowing behind her like liquid fire. The widow of the late Crown Prince Alexander had maintained her dignity through 3 years of mourning, but tonight felt different. Tonight, she sensed the subtle shifts in court politics that threatened to strip away the last vestiges of her royal standing. The ballroom buzzed with whispered conversations, as nobles from across the kingdom gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the Great Peace Treaty. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies. Lady Eleanor moved through the crowd with practiced grace, acknowledging bows and curtsies with gentle nods, her sapphire tiara catching the light with each movement. She had arrived early, as was proper for someone of her position. The late Crown Prince Alexander had been beloved by the people, a charismatic leader who had died tragically in a riding accident just months before he was to be crowned king. Eleanor had been his devoted wife for 7 years, standing by his side through diplomatic challenges and court intrigue. Now, as his widow, she held a special place of honor in the kingdom's hierarchy. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with a ceremonial flourish, and the palace herald announced the arrival of Queen Victoria Astoria and her new consort, Lord Marcus Thornfield. The Queen had remarried just 1 year after losing her first husband, King Edmund, to illness. The swift remarriage had raised eyebrows among the nobility, but protocol demanded respect for the sovereign's decisions. Queen Victoria entered with regal bearing, her silver crown gleaming atop her auburn hair. She wore a deep purple gown embroidered with golden threads that formed intricate patterns of roses and thorns. Lord Marcus walked beside her, his military uniform crisp and adorned with medals from his service in the Royal Navy. He was a handsome man in his 40s, with sharp features and calculating eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. As the royal couple made their procession through the ballroom, Eleanor noticed something that made her breath catch. Queen Victoria was steering their path directly toward the high table where the seat of honor traditionally awaited. This particular chair, carved from ancient oak and upholstered in royal blue velvet, had been reserved for Eleanor at every major court function since her husband's death. It was her rightful place as the widow of the former crown prince, a position that carried both ceremonial importance and practical influence within the court's complex social structure. The Queen's intentions became crystal clear as she approached the high table. Lord Marcus whispered something in her ear, and Victoria nodded with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what was about to happen. The new queen consort was planning to claim the seat of honor for herself, effectively diminishing Eleanor's status in front of the entire assembled nobility. Eleanor's lady-in-waiting, Miss Catherine Fairfax, appeared at her side with a worried expression. "My lady," she whispered urgently, "perhaps we should take our seats at the secondary table. The Queen seems to have other plans for the evening." But Eleanor remained motionless, her training in royal protocol warring with her sense of justice. The seat of honor wasn't merely about comfort or prestige. It represented her connection to the late crown prince and her continuing role as a bridge between the old regime and the new. To give it up without a fight would be to abandon not only her own dignity but also the memory of her beloved Alexander. The tension in the room was palpable as other nobles began to notice the unfolding drama. Conversations quieted to hushed murmurs as eyes darted between Eleanor and the approaching royal couple. The palace staff, trained to maintain neutrality in court politics, continued their duties with studied indifference, but even they seemed to move with extra care, as if sensing the electricity in the air. Lord Marcus reached the seat of honor first and placed his hand on its high back, a gesture that sent ripples of shock through the assembled guests. This was unprecedented. No consort, regardless of their marriage to the reigning monarch, had ever claimed precedence over the widow of a crown prince. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her silk gloves, but her expression remained serene. Queen Victoria approached her with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Dear Eleanor," she said in a voice that carried across the room, "how lovely you look this evening. I trust you'll understand that as the current queen, certain adjustments to seating arrangements are necessary to reflect the proper order of succession." The Queen's words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable to casual observers, but Eleanor understood their true meaning. This was about power, pure and simple. Victoria was consolidating her authority and removing any potential challenges to her reign, even symbolic ones. Eleanor's popularity with the people and her moral authority as Alexander's widow represented a threat that the queen was determined to eliminate. Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she considered her response. The easy path would be to acquiesce gracefully, to take a lesser seat and maintain the peace. But something deep within her rebelled against this public humiliation. Alexander would never have stood for such treatment of someone under his protection, and she would not dishonor his memory by submitting to this calculated insult. As the moment stretched taut like a bowstring, Eleanor became aware of a presence beside her. She turned slightly to see Captain James Whitmore, the head of the Royal Guard, standing at attention in his ceremonial uniform. His jaw was set in a firm line, and his usually calm eyes held a spark of something that looked remarkably like defiance. Captain James Whitmore had served the royal family for 15 years, rising through the ranks from a young lieutenant to the prestigious position of Royal Guard captain. His loyalty had never been questioned, his duty never wavering, even through the chaos of 2 royal deaths and a controversial remarriage. But tonight, as he watched Queen Victoria's calculated power play unfold, something stirred within him that transcended mere obedience to orders. He had been personally appointed to his position by the late Crown Prince Alexander, who had recognized in James not just military competence but moral integrity. During his years of service, James had witnessed the genuine love between Alexander and Eleanor, their dedication to the kingdom's welfare, and their natural grace under pressure. Eleanor had never demanded special treatment, never abused her position, and had conducted herself with dignity that earned respect from both nobility and common folk alike. James's hand rested on the ceremonial sword at his side as he surveyed the scene. Protocol dictated that he should remain neutral in matters of court politics, but this situation was testing the very foundations of his oath. He had sworn to protect the royal family, but which family did that oath truly serve? The current queen who ruled through political maneuvering and strategic marriage, or the memory of the prince who had embodied the kingdom's highest ideals? The tension in the ballroom had reached a breaking point. Lady Eleanor stood frozen between dignity and submission, while Queen Victoria waited with barely concealed impatience for her to step aside. The assembled nobles watched in fascination and horror, knowing that whatever happened next would reshape the court's power structure for years to come. Lord Marcus tightened his grip on the seat of honor, his knuckles whitening beneath his gloves. He was a military man himself, though his service had been more political than heroic. His rise to power had come through careful cultivation of the right connections rather than battlefield valor. Now, as he prepared to claim a seat that had never been intended for someone of his status, he avoided meeting the eyes of the serving officers present. James noticed the subtle signs of discomfort among his fellow guardsmen. These were men who had served under Prince Alexander's direct command, who had witnessed his character firsthand. They shifted restlessly at their posts, their usual discipline strained by the moral complexity of the situation unfolding before them. Miss Catherine Fairfax stepped closer to Eleanor, her voice barely audible. "My lady, please. This confrontation serves no purpose. We can address this matter through proper channels later." But Eleanor's resolve was hardening with each passing second. "Proper channels," she repeated softly, her voice carrying an edge of steel that surprised even herself. "And tell me, Catherine, what proper channels exist for a queen who chooses to ignore 3 centuries of royal protocol for her own convenience?" Queen Victoria's smile became increasingly strained as she realized that Eleanor would not simply acquiesce. "My dear child," she said, her tone patronizing, "surely you understand that traditions must sometimes evolve to serve the current needs of the crown. Your late husband, may he rest in peace, would want you to support the stability of the realm above personal sentiment." The mention of Alexander ignited something fierce in Eleanor's eyes. "Do not presume to speak for my husband's wishes, Your Majesty. Prince Alexander believed in honor, in keeping faith with those who had earned their place through service and sacrifice. He would never have supported the arbitrary removal of rightfully held privileges." A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom. Eleanor had just challenged the Queen directly, publicly, and in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. This was no longer a simple matter of seating arrangements. It had become a fundamental question about the nature of royal authority and the limits of sovereign power. James felt his heart racing as he processed the implications of Eleanor's words. She was right, of course, but being right and being safe were often mutually exclusive in the dangerous world of court politics. Queen Victoria's expression had shifted from irritation to something much colder and more dangerous. Lord Marcus leaned forward to whisper in his wife's ear, his words inaudible to the crowd but his intent clear from his aggressive posture. He was advising escalation, James realized, pushing for a response that would crush Eleanor's defiance and establish the new order through sheer force of will. The Queen nodded slightly at her consort's counsel, then addressed the room with renewed authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe this evening's festivities have been delayed long enough by this unfortunate misunderstanding. Lady Eleanor, you will take your assigned seat at the east table, or you will find yourself escorted from these proceedings entirely." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword ready to fall. Eleanor's face had gone pale, but her spine remained straight. She understood the consequences of continued resistance: social exile, loss of her royal pension, possible banishment from court entirely. Yet something in her refused to yield to this public humiliation. James found himself taking a step forward before conscious thought could stop him. The movement was small, barely perceptible to most observers, but it placed him squarely between Queen Victoria and Lady Eleanor. His action sent a ripple of shock through the royal guards stationed around the room. "Captain Whitmore," the Queen said sharply, recognizing the implicit challenge in his positioning. "Resume your proper post immediately." James met her gaze steadily, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, my post is wherever honor and tradition require me to stand." The words sent a jolt through the assembled crowd. A royal guard captain had just defied a direct order from the sovereign, placing his career, his freedom, and possibly his life in jeopardy. But James had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the rightness of his position filled him with a clarity he had never experienced. Queen Victoria's face flushed with rage at this unprecedented act of insubordination. "You forget yourself, Captain. Your oath is to the crown, not to outdated customs or misplaced loyalties." James's response was measured and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of a master swordsman. "My oath is to protect what is right, Your Majesty. And what is happening here is not right." The ballroom erupted into chaos as Captain James Whitmore's words echoed off the marble walls. Nobles gasped and whispered frantically among themselves, while palace staff froze in place, unsure whether to continue their duties or flee from the unprecedented confrontation unfolding before them. Never in the kingdom's long history had a royal guard captain publicly defied the reigning monarch in such dramatic fashion. Queen Victoria's composure cracked completely, her carefully maintained royal facade crumbling under the weight of public humiliation. Her voice rose to a pitch that bordered on shrill as she pointed an accusatory finger at James. "How dare you speak to your sovereign in such a manner? Guards, arrest this traitor immediately." But as her command rang out across the ballroom, something extraordinary happened. Not a single member of the royal guard moved to obey. The dozen men stationed around the room remained at their posts, their expressions conflicted but their feet planted firmly in place. These were soldiers who had served under Prince Alexander, who had witnessed his leadership and integrity firsthand. The moral authority that James had invoked resonated with their own sense of duty and honor. Sergeant William Drake, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of service, took a half-step forward from his position near the main entrance. His weathered face bore the scars of battles fought in defense of the realm, and his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had seen too much to be easily intimidated. "Captain Whitmore speaks truly," he said in a voice that carried across the silent room. "The seat of honor has belonged to Lady Eleanor by right and tradition. To strip it from her now, without cause or ceremony, goes against everything we have sworn to protect." The sergeant's support emboldened other guards to voice their agreement. Lieutenant Thomas Ashford, a young officer who had been personally mentored by Prince Alexander, stepped forward from his position near the royal table. "The prince would never have permitted such treatment of his widow," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We serve the crown, but we also serve justice." Lord Marcus's face had turned purple with rage at this open mutiny within the very heart of the palace. As a former naval officer, he understood the critical importance of absolute obedience to authority. This breakdown of discipline threatened not just the evening's events, but the entire foundation of royal power. "This is treason!" he shouted, his military bearing completely abandoned. "You will all face court-martial and execution for this insubordination." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The guards had reached a point where moral conviction outweighed fear of consequences. They had witnessed too many compromises, too many departures from the principles that had once defined their service. In Captain Whitmore's stand, they found an opportunity to reclaim their honor. Lady Eleanor watched in amazement as the scene unfolded around her. She had never intended for her simple refusal to sit elsewhere to trigger such a dramatic confrontation. These brave men were risking everything to defend a principle that went far beyond mere seating arrangements. They were defending the idea that tradition and honor still mattered in a world increasingly driven by political expediency. Miss Catherine Fairfax pulled at Eleanor's sleeve, her voice urgent with worry. "My lady, perhaps now would be an appropriate time to withdraw. This situation has escalated far beyond what anyone anticipated." But Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I cannot abandon these men now, Catherine. They have chosen to make a stand for what is right, and I will not let their sacrifice be in vain." The deadlock continued as Queen Victoria found herself facing an unprecedented crisis of authority. Her commands were being openly ignored, her power challenged by those sworn to protect her. The assembled nobility watched in fascination and terror, knowing that they were witnessing a moment that would be recorded in the kingdom's history books. Duke Harrison Blackstone, Eleanor's father-in-law, and one of the most powerful nobles in the realm, chose this moment to make his allegiance clear. The elderly duke had remained silent throughout the initial confrontation, but the guard's display of courage seemed to steel his own resolve. He stepped forward from his position among the assembled peers, his walking stick tapping authoritatively against the marble floor. "Your Majesty," he said in a voice that carried the weight of decades of political experience, "perhaps this matter could be resolved through negotiation rather than force. The kingdom has seen enough conflict and division. Surely accommodation can be reached that preserves both your authority and the honored traditions of our realm." The Duke's intervention provided Queen Victoria with a potential face-saving exit from the confrontation. She could agree to negotiations, allow Eleanor to retain her seat for this evening, and deal with the rebellious guards through less public channels. But Lord Marcus's influence proved stronger than diplomatic wisdom. "There will be no negotiation with traitors," he declared, his hand moving to the ceremonial sword at his own side. "These men have forgotten their duty, and they will be reminded of it through steel if necessary." His threat to draw weapons within the sacred confines of the ballroom sent shockwaves through the crowd. Such an action would violate every principle of royal protocol and transform a political dispute into a potential bloodbath. The nobles began to back away from the confrontation, seeking safety behind marble pillars and ornate furniture. Captain Whitmore remained calm in the face of Lord Marcus's escalating threats. His own hand rested casually on his sword hilt, not in preparation for violence, but as a reminder of the authority he carried. "My lord," he said with careful formality, "I would strongly advise against any action that might endanger the safety of the assembled guests. This is a matter of principle, not warfare." The captain's measured response only seemed to inflame Lord Marcus further. "Principle?" he scoffed. "You speak of principle while defying the direct commands of your sovereign? You have forgotten what it means to serve." James's eyes flashed with a dangerous light at this accusation. "I have forgotten nothing, my lord. I remember every oath I have taken, every promise I have made, every man I have served beside in defense of this realm. I remember Prince Alexander's final words to me before his death, when he asked me to ensure that his wife would always be protected and honored. That memory guides my actions tonight." The invocation of Prince Alexander's deathbed wishes sent a visible tremor through the assembled crowd. Many present had loved and respected the late Crown Prince, and the suggestion that his dying concerns were being trampled for political convenience struck a powerful emotional chord. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes at James's words. She had not known about Alexander's final conversation with the captain, but it explained so much about the loyalty and protection she had felt during her years of widowhood. Her husband had planned for this moment, understanding that his death would leave her vulnerable to exactly the kind of political maneuvering she now faced. The revelation of Prince Alexander's deathbed wishes created a profound shift in the atmosphere of the ballroom. What had begun as a dispute over protocol had transformed into something much deeper, a clash between the calculating politics of the new regime and the honorable traditions of the old. Lady Eleanor felt the weight of her late husband's foresight, his understanding that she would someday need protection from forces that valued power over principle. Queen Victoria sensed the change in the room's dynamic as murmurs of sympathy for Eleanor began to ripple through the assembled nobility. The Queen's political instincts, honed through years of court intrigue, warned her that public opinion was shifting against her. Yet Lord Marcus's influence continued to push her toward escalation rather than compromise. "These are the desperate fabrications of men facing the consequences of their treason," Lord Marcus declared, his voice echoing off the ballroom's vaulted ceiling. "Captain Whitmore seeks to hide his insubordination behind convenient claims about the dead, who cannot contradict his lies." The accusation that James was dishonoring Prince Alexander's memory sparked immediate outrage among the assembled guards. These were men who had served alongside their captain for years, who knew his character and integrity intimately. The suggestion that he would fabricate such a sacred trust struck at the very heart of military honor. Sergeant Drake stepped forward again, his scarred face hard with determination. "Lord Marcus speaks of lies," he said in a voice that carried the authority of long service. "But those of us who were present at the prince's deathbed know the truth of Captain Whitmore's words. Prince Alexander spoke extensively about his concerns for Lady Eleanor's future, and he specifically charged our captain with her protection." Lieutenant Ashford nodded grimly in support of his sergeant's testimony. "I was there as well, my lords and ladies. The prince's final hours were spent not in self-pity, but in careful planning for those he would leave behind. His love for Lady Eleanor and his concern for her welfare were evident to all present. The weight of corroborated testimony from multiple witnesses began to tell on the assembled crowd. These were not men given to flights of fancy or political manipulation. They were soldiers, trained to observe and report accurately, and their unanimous support for James's account carried considerable credibility. Duke Blackstone seized upon this moment to press his case for peaceful resolution. "Your Majesty," he addressed Queen Victoria with careful diplomacy, "it seems clear that this matter touches upon sacred obligations that transcend immediate political considerations. Perhaps the wisdom of Solomon is needed here, a solution that honors both your authority and the solemn promises made to the dying." Eleanor found her voice for the first time since the confrontation had escalated beyond her control. When she spoke, it was with a clarity and strength that surprised even herself. "Your Majesty, I never sought this conflict. I came here tonight to honor the memory of those who died for peace, not to challenge your rule. But I cannot abandon the principles that my husband died believing in, nor can I stand by while brave men suffer for defending what is right." Her words carried across the silent ballroom with remarkable power. This was not the plea of a desperate woman clinging to privilege, but the principled stand of someone willing to face consequences for her convictions. The assembled nobility found themselves forced to confront their own complicity in the erosion of the values they claimed to hold dear. Queen Victoria's political calculations grew more complex by the moment. She could continue to escalate the confrontation, potentially triggering a wider rebellion among the palace guards and alienating the noble families whose support she needed. Alternatively, she could find a face-saving compromise that preserved her authority while accommodating Eleanor's position. The choice would define her reign and determine whether she ruled through fear or respect. Lord Marcus, however, seemed incapable of reading the shifting political winds. His military background had trained him for decisive action rather than subtle maneuvering, and he interpreted any hesitation as weakness. "Enough of this theater," he declared, taking a step toward Captain Whitmore with his hand now firmly gripping his sword hilt. "Stand down immediately, or face the consequences of your rebellion." The threat of imminent violence sent a ripple of panic through the assembled nobles, but Captain Whitmore remained unmoved. His years of military training had prepared him for far worse threats than those posed by an angry consort. More importantly, his moral conviction had reached a point where physical danger seemed irrelevant compared to the principle at stake. "My lord," James replied with deadly calm, "I would advise you to consider your actions very carefully. The men under my command have served this kingdom with distinction for many years. They deserve better than to be branded traitors for upholding the very values that this court claims to represent." The captain's words carried an implicit warning that Lord Marcus was too enraged to fully comprehend. The Royal Guard's loyalty was not simply a matter of following orders. It was built on mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and common commitment to ideals larger than any individual. To threaten that foundation was to risk consequences that extended far beyond a single evening's confrontation. Eleanor stepped forward, positioning herself between the two men whose conflict threatened to spill over into violence. Her movement was graceful but deliberate, a calculated risk that demonstrated her willingness to bear personal cost for the sake of peace. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that somehow managed to be both gentle and commanding, "surely we can resolve this matter without resort to threats or violence." Her intervention created a moment of stillness in which all parties could step back from the brink of irreversible action. The assembled crowd held its collective breath, sensing that the next few seconds would determine whether the evening ended in reconciliation or catastrophe. Duke Blackstone recognized the opportunity and moved swiftly to capitalize on it. "Your Majesty," he addressed Queen Victoria with renewed urgency, "I propose a solution that preserves all parties' honor. Allow Lady Eleanor to retain her traditional seat for this evening, in recognition of Prince Alexander's specific wishes. In return, establish a royal commission to review and modernize court protocols for future occasions. This approach honors the past while providing for orderly change in the future." The Duke's proposal offered Queen Victoria everything she needed: immediate resolution of the crisis, preservation of her authority, and a mechanism for implementing her desired changes through legitimate channels. It also provided Lord Marcus with a face-saving exit from his increasingly untenable position. The Duke's diplomatic proposal hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. Queen Victoria's sharp political instincts recognized the wisdom of accepting a compromise that would allow her to emerge from the crisis with her authority intact, while avoiding a confrontation that could destabilize her reign. Yet Lord Marcus's influence continued to complicate the situation, his military pride refusing to accept what he perceived as a surrender to insubordination. Lady Eleanor studied the Queen's face, searching for signs of which path she would choose. The past few minutes had revealed much about the character of those around her: Captain Whitmore's unwavering integrity, the loyalty of the palace guards, the political wisdom of her father-in-law, and the dangerous impulsiveness of Lord Marcus. Most importantly, she had discovered something about herself that she had never fully understood: her own capacity for moral courage when everything she valued was at stake. The assembled nobility waited in tense silence, aware that they were witnessing a defining moment in their kingdom's history. The outcome would determine not just the evening's seating arrangements, but the fundamental question of whether tradition and honor still held meaning in their changing world. Captain Whitmore maintained his protective stance near Eleanor, his hand resting calmly on his sword hilt. His men remained at their posts around the ballroom, their unified display of principle having created an unprecedented situation in royal protocol. These were career soldiers who understood the gravity of their actions, yet they stood firm in their conviction that some principles were worth any sacrifice. Queen Victoria's internal struggle was visible to those who knew how to read the subtle signs of court politics. Her eyes moved from Eleanor to the guards to the assembled nobles, calculating the long-term consequences of each possible choice. She had worked too hard to reach her current position to risk it all for the sake of her consort's wounded pride. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the measured authority of a ruler who had made a difficult but necessary decision. "Duke Blackstone's proposal has merit," she announced, the words falling like stones into the silent ballroom. "We shall indeed establish a royal commission to review and modernize our court protocols. Tonight, however, we shall honor the traditions that have served our kingdom well for centuries." The Queen's words represented a strategic retreat that preserved her dignity while acknowledging the strength of the opposition she faced. Lord Marcus's face darkened with disappointment and barely controlled rage, but he could not openly contradict his wife's decision without further undermining royal authority. Lady Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her as the immediate crisis passed. She had not sought this confrontation, but neither had she been willing to compromise her principles when challenged. The support she had received from unexpected quarters, particularly from Captain Whitmore and his men, had demonstrated that honor and loyalty still commanded respect within the kingdom's institutions. Captain Whitmore allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction as he witnessed the peaceful resolution of what could have been a catastrophic confrontation. His career might still face consequences from the evening's events, but he had kept faith with his oath to protect Lady Eleanor and uphold the values that Prince Alexander had embodied. As the immediate tension began to dissipate, the practical arrangements for the evening's gala still needed to be addressed. Lady Eleanor moved with quiet dignity toward the seat of honor, her rightful place, now explicitly confirmed by royal decree. The assembled nobles watched with a mixture of admiration and relief as she took her position, the crisis having elevated her status rather than diminished it. Queen Victoria, demonstrating the political acumen that had brought her to power, graciously escorted Lord Marcus to the seats that had been prepared for the royal couple. Her ability to accept the compromise while maintaining her regal bearing impressed even those who had opposed her actions earlier in the evening. The palace staff, who had frozen in terror during the confrontation, resumed their duties with visible relief. The orchestra, which had been preparing for the evening's entertainment, struck up a ceremonial fanfare that helped restore the formal atmosphere appropriate to such a grand occasion. Duke Blackstone approached his daughter-in-law with evident pride in his weathered features. "You conducted yourself with remarkable grace tonight, my dear," he said quietly, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine affection. "Alexander would have been proud of your strength and dignity." Eleanor's eyes misted with emotion at the Duke's words. Throughout the evening's crisis, she had felt her late husband's presence guiding her actions. The knowledge that Captain Whitmore had been specifically charged with her protection provided a comforting sense of continuity with the past and security for the future. As the guests settled into their proper places and the evening's formal proceedings began, the events of the past hour took on an almost dreamlike quality. Yet the lessons learned and the relationships forged during those crucial moments would have lasting consequences for everyone present. Captain Whitmore resumed his professional demeanor, but the respect in his men's eyes had deepened considerably. They had witnessed their leader make the most difficult choice any soldier could face, choosing principle over orders, and they had followed him without hesitation. The bond between them had been strengthened by shared moral courage. The Royal Commission on Court Protocol, established as part of the evening's compromise, would eventually recommend modest modernizations while preserving the essential traditions that gave meaning to royal ceremony. Queen Victoria would find ways to assert her authority through other means, while Lord Marcus would gradually learn to channel his ambitions through more diplomatic channels. As the Peace Gala continued into the night with its planned ceremonies and entertainments, those present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. In an age when political expediency often trumped moral principle, a small group of individuals had chosen to make a stand for what they believed was right. Lady Eleanor would remember this evening for the rest of her life, not as a political victory, but as a moment when the values her husband had cherished proved stronger than the forces that sought to diminish them. The seat of honor remained hers not because of rank or privilege, but because sometimes, when good people refuse to surrender their principles, tradition and honor can still triumph over expedience and ambition. The royal court had learned that true authority comes not from the power to compel obedience, but from the wisdom to command respect. And in the quiet satisfaction visible on Captain Whitmore's face as he watched over the peaceful conclusion of the gala, there was the knowledge that some oaths are sacred enough to risk everything to preserve.